interesting about that was this address, really, although you didn't explicitly refer to it, to the politics of landscape urbanism. And thinking of that politics, because you mentioned Hilbersheim was practicing a form of realpolitik, rather than saying, I'm a socialist, I must follow this kind of socialist left-wing kind of party line in terms of planning. He kind of addresses the real conditions. And then you're looking at more contemporary practice, and it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying, well, the reality now is neoliberalism, more or less everywhere. So landscape urbanism needs to engage with those conditions strategically. Yeah, I know. It's not working. So,
I think everyone heard you. Yes?
No. Okay. Speaking up. Yeah. So, if it does that in the examples you're looking at, I'm just wondering what the deal is, what the outcome is of that engaging with neoliberalism in that way. And particularly the Highline project, it might sort of raise some kind of eyebrows or some questions in that how it's successful is to increase the land values, and that's kind of how it gets built. So I'm wondering if there is still a space within the adoption of that strategy for landscape urbanism to also pursue some of that, agenda which is about kind of contesting existing social conditions, to draw on those things that Hilbersheim was interested in. Himself, no doubt, influenced by people like Kropotkin and Geddes, going right back, who are anarchists, who were as far left as you can get. So I just wondered, what you saw as the potential for that kind of engagement through the kind of strategies you're looking at.
I mean, that's the question of the talk, so thanks for listening. I don't know if it made it beyond the second row, but at least you got that. It's one of the kind of fundamental contradictions, and it's not something that I've completely worked out in my own mind, but it seems increasingly clear that one of the reasons that landscape urbanism has emerged is the relative inability of the older models or paradigms to deal with this new economic condition. So I would just start there. One of the reasons that I like the Hilbersheimer example, even though there are problems with recuperating Hilbersheimer, he was a guy whose social credentials, his credentials on the left, were unimpeached. This is a guy who, as you rightly point out, he subtitled the new regional pattern Factories, Farms, and Fields, or whatever the Kropotkin reference. So explicitly, right on the cover of the book, Kropotkin is referenced. And Hilbs is getting his material from at least two places. He's got, on the one hand, the Soviet desurbanists and the Kropotkins and the French Soviet anarchic tradition. And then he's got the kind of Anglo Garden City thing, right? And he's kind of melding those two traditions together. But my reading of Hilbersheimer is that in immigrating to the US and in his professional career, he maintains his commitment to the social, and he's increasingly literate about the environmental. I describe him as a proto-ecological urbanist, I think is a fair reading, given what he was doing. And in that context, he occupied a position in which he had a kind of social position, and he had an environmental literacy. And he was working with the architect of the day that had maybe his more cultural capital than anyone else, right? So that intersection strikes me as particularly desirable ground these days, because at least in North America, we've kind of balkanized ourselves into, well, you can either be socially engaged, but that's at the expense of really engaging in anything that gets built or any proposals for the real world, or you can be environmentally literate, but that's somehow meant to be at the exclusion of human beings, right? So in this post-68, especially planning world we occupy, we've kind of hived ourselves off into these positions. And what I find in Hilbersheimer is an intersection of things, while it's occasionally problematic, would be a desirable position for us to be able to occupy today, right? Yeah. One of the ways that Hilbersheimer maintained his credentials is he resigned almost every commission he had. Because he eventually got to the point where he said, basta, I'm out, I can't do this. And the one commission that he ultimately could not talk himself out of was Lafayette Park. So the Mies formulation was that the problem with Hilbs is you had to have all Hilbs or nothing, basically. Yeah. So in the end, I'm interested that Hilbersheimer doesn't cite Kropotkin in the text of the new regional pattern. He cites Henry Ford, of all figures, right? So I'm reading Hilbersheimer to be quite, not not misty-eyed or romantic, but very clear-sighted and very literate about the forces at work in the American city. And I think his understanding of planning or design was to use design to insulate populations from the worst effects of capital. But I don't think he had any misunderstandings over what that power relationship was. And I think it's fair to say that in the culture that I was educated in the design disciplines, the value system that we've been given is one to essentially use culture as an effect, a way to turn back the forces of capital. And so I read David Harvey, and I'm a kind of a modest reader into that literature. And the more I read that, and the more that I look at the available options that we have, the idea that we should use cultural production as a mechanism to foster the economic revolution that would be necessary to build the kind of robust public realm that many of us aspire to strikes me as increasingly kind of naive. And I think that's a pretty obvious sentiment that many of us might share. I also don't see many indicators on the horizons that I occupy of what the new welfare paradigm is going to look like. I don't know what it would, what forms it might come in. And so increasingly what I see in landscape urbanist practice is a fluency and a literacy with private capital. And it makes many of my colleagues on the so-called old left somewhere on a sliding scale from nervous to just enraged, but I don't think we have many options left. Right. And given that, it's not surprising that Corner and Hughes or others would necessarily have to become fluent in private capital. But I do think that there are still social and environmental benefits, and that those ends do justify the means.
Thanks very much. Okay, some other questions, please.
I have the impression from your talk that we can consider landscape urbanism as a way of thinking. Is it possible that we can use this way of thinking to understand society, not the way we design physical things, but the way we understand the city in relation to different groups, like in relation to gender, ethnicity, or class?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the simplest answer is I think it's possible, but maybe not very effective. I think if we want to isolate and have a conversation about questions of identity, right, or the politics around identity or bodies and race, ethnicity, gender, or their implications in public space, I think we have other mechanisms for doing that. We can have a conversation about the role of landscape urbanist work and that discourse. But in the first instance, I think landscape urbanism claims that if you're interested to develop ideas about or formulate the spatial configuration of a city today, landscape has emerged as a medium of design that's much more fluent and much more capable than either architecture or urban design. So it's initially a kind of clarification of the way in which cities have grown and the efficacy of intervening in them. Okay? If we take a step back from that and talk about planning and talk about the kinds of things we've been talking about tonight, it brings up this question of the political. And then as a part of that, we could talk about gender, race, ethnicity. We could talk about class as well. And I was hoping to kind of, if I didn't make this clear, at least hint at the implications for class along the way. I don't think this is all fun and games. I do think that there are winners and losers. But what I do want to suggest is that increasingly, landscape urbanist practice is perceived to be capable of dealing in contexts of neoliberal capital. And to the extent we occupy places that are increasingly driven by that neoliberal capital, it seems to be gaining some traction. Having said that, I think that there are any number of ways of talking about gender, race, ethnicity, the body politic. But my instinct is to talk about them relative to the body politic in a political discussion about public space. Because as we pursue those conversations, what I find increasingly is that space still matters. My friend and dean, George Baird at Toronto, his work, the book The Space of Appearance, and his reading of Hannah Arendt and others is still equally relevant, that every time we think space as a category or the city as a category is no longer relevant, all of a sudden, they're protesting Gaza in front of the embassy. Like space matters all of a sudden, right? So I would be tending to want to pursue that conversation. One of the bigger questions that I think we could touch on would be the relationship between species. It's not exactly gender, race, ethnicity, but bear with me for a second. There is a pretty vibrant discourse in North America around questions of speciesism and the relationship between animals. And one of the kind of, if you're looking for a doctoral topic out there, if you want to pick up the architectural culture's interest in animalia in the last 10 years and read the work of Carrie Wolf and others who are interested in animal rights and what they mean for human subjectivity, there's a dissertation there waiting to be knocked out of the park, because there's quite a lot of material there. I mean, landscape urbanist practice depends upon, promotes species, right? It's first and foremost about thinking about the city from the point of view of species, because ecology is the species' relationship to their environment, right? And the idea that human beings are one species within that framework. Now, many people that read into this say that, well, no matter how aggressive we are about the fish or the frogs, this is still very anthropocentric. So there's a long way to go, and I haven't said much about the relationship between different kinds of human bodies, but it does strike me that there are implications of this that touch on gender and class and ethnicity. Having said that, the overall economic paradigm tends to subsume a lot of those discussions. The most obvious place to go would either be animalia and species, or class, maybe directly, and class distinctions directly. I don't know, does that seem fair to you? I mean, I don't want to duck the question, but I think that's as I understand it, where we are today. Yeah. There are some quarters where the post-68, the old left's kind of pursuing of identity politics has also overreached in certain contexts. And I don't feel that way personally or in my own work, but I'll see many commentators who argue that the pursuit of those questions in the absence of other topics has actually not helped us in discussions of the built environment, particularly with respect to class, with respect to the social or to the environmental. Well, a part of what I was trying to reference there was, I don't think it's me per se, but I think it's our design culture and its appetite for novelty. And I'm on pretty firm ground here on Bedford Square arguing that there are places in which you have to have the next new thing, right? And that cuts both ways. I think the point is a crucial one, and it's been among the more important kind of Achilles heels of this whole project, essentially, is that on the one hand, the canon of 10 or 15 years ago are projects that basically pushed into the future a series of indeterminate future outcomes, right? Because they essentially moved from a kind of master plan model or a model of physical form of urban design or planning and said, no, that's too fragile. Those utopias are never built. They're hardly perfect. Let's look at models from nature. And those models from nature tended to stress indeterminacy, responsiveness, resiliency. So the language that was initially being described was one that came from the discussion of systems that were self-organizing. And the fact that those became very useful for describing cities didn't get lost on people. But then the body of work became very vulnerable because, as you say, well, that's great, 3 frogs in year 1, but in year 25, what are we going to have? Because as mayor, my mandate is 4 years, and I'm out, right? When Jim Corner and Stan Allen lost the Downsview competition, what I told them was they produced in that project, they summed up about 10 years of research. They set up an entire program of additional work to be done by producing the most complex, richly detailed, and supple example of that thought. By definition, there's no jury that can pick it, period. Like, by definition. And I think they understood that. It's not a surprise that the Downsview jury selected the kind of, I wasn't on that group, but they selected the kind of Teletubby image, the kind of circular, pastoral, everything's fine. Because of this, the vulnerability of elected officials in public discourse today. Toronto and New York have emerged as the 2 most vibrant venues. They have under contract half a dozen landscape urbanists today. And the fact that Bloomberg has just kind of re-engineered a third term in the context of term limits is not unrelated to this. So what I see is, on the one hand, the basic landscape urbanist project is basically arguing for a future open-endedness and responsiveness to conditions in the future as a model taken from nature. We live in a political economy and in a fiscal economy which are increasingly driven by this quarter. How did I do this month? And those two things are at odds with one another. And I think it's an obvious open question for a number of us that are looking at this field. What I would say is that there's a potential benefit to that point of view as well. And we see it in projects where they're so sufficiently long-term that they're perceived to be non-threatening. The other upsides are, first of all, these projects are done with such modest funding, particularly the ones that are mostly landscape. One of the advantages is you can do them with almost nothing, right? Like at Downsview right now, because they don't have money to implement, what they're doing is they're farming land. They simply plow wheat crops and other grasses into the soil year after year to build the capacity for soil. And at Fresh Kills, simply growing the soil is 10 years of work. And Corner will tell you that it's a very effective publicity campaign for the future park. Now, what that means for the build-out of the public realm is obviously an open question. But in that trade-off, I think what we've done is we've said we're not going to tax ourselves as aggressively to pay collectively for robust public parks and robust public spaces. That decision has already been taken. I may disagree with it, but ultimately it's a fait accompli. In that context, landscape urbanism has emerged as a kind of toolbox of things that one can do in a very, very low-grade way over time. So in places like Detroit or in places like Fresh Kills, very, very modest environmental management practices can actually sustain and grow complexity over time in a way that doesn't have the same kind of design capital or cultural capital or celebrity that you referred to. On the other hand, in places like China and other places that are concentrated with capital, they can actually accelerate a bit. And that's maybe about as far as I could go by way of a defense at this point. Let's go to Bronzy instead.
Okay. But it's like, okay, so these are landscape architects doing urbanism, so they all have to be just the same as any other, master plan there is out there. And the only thing that looks really sexy and cool is the landscape because they seem to be doing landscape architecture.
Yeah, the initial response to landscape urbanism in landscape architect circles in North America was, well, this is what we already do. What do you mean? And that's not exactly what you said, but I just want to put that out there, that was the initial, kind of inoculation was, this is what we've been doing. This is simply architects are co-opting. They're taking away our stuff. And they were worried about, market share, basically. 10 years on, I think now it's clear to say that they see the advantage. So all of a sudden, in 1 month, in October of '09, there's going to be a 2-week conference of landscape architects in Beijing, a week in Brazil, all around landscape urbanism. And I think it's because they understand the potential within their disciplinary framework. More recently, a guy, Rodolfo Machado, who's the chair of urban planning and design at Harvard, he said in print a year ago in an interview, he said that he was very polite about it because it was in print. He said, the ultimate urban disposition form of landscape urbanism has yet to arrive. And that was the most generous reading of that position that you suggest, which is, well, they just haven't gotten around to it. Right? And there's, and I think there is that reading, which is, oh, well, it just hasn't really, they haven't gotten their theoretical act together, or they don't have enough practical examples, or maybe it's all in 40 years in the fullness of time, right? A part of, you can see what I'm doing in this talk is, if you'd seen this talk 3 years ago, we had the same canon of work from 10 years ago, but we didn't have nearly as many examples of people that actually had infrastructure and engineering and urban design commissions. And what I'm trying to build in the second half of the talk is, half a dozen examples where we can quibble about density or is there people or not. This is urbanism, right? I mean, particularly in the ones in which we're looking at housing, right? I mean, so what I tried to end with, among the Toronto examples or the Chinese example, this is urban design. And ultimately, if you were to see more of the kind of build out, I'm not so sure I would immediately give over that they look just like a block anywhere else. Now, we would have to qualify the idea about block structure, but a part of using this image rhetorically, right, is to suggest that if you do in fact begin with the sex-like life of fish, and if you then take them seriously and then engineer out of that infrastructure, a part of what you get is a block structure. Wow, it looks great on my screen, sorry. Try this. I was pulling up one of the images from Toronto, from that last project in Toronto. A part of what you get is you get a block structure, which is exactly not like all other blocks. That's exactly a part of my point, and maybe what I need to do is a better job of that in future, because a part of my argument is that traditionally, questions of urban form have come from a variety of places, right? They've come from precedent, they've come from the history of the city itself, they've come from maybe modernist ideas about efficiency or depth or light or air. Maybe they came from real estate development practice or kind of laissez-faire development. More recently, they've also come from a kind of avant-gardist tendency within architectural culture that says, screw urbanism, we've got enough architecture, we'll just make it big enough. And and this has essentially been Sébastien Marot's reading of OMA, is that you can divide OMA into the suburbanism, the kind of landscapey stuff, the horizontal stuff, and superurbanism, the kind of social mixity and dense collectors of smuggling urbanism into a building program, basically. What I'm hoping to show, at least in the Toronto example and in the Chinese example, are these are questions of urban form. The question of the block, the depth of the block, the orientation of the block, and in the more full kind of rollout of the Shenzhen project, this Longgang project, what you see is a range of typological studies. And I think at the cutting edge of this work, what you see is maybe function F7. What you see is you see block structure, the dimension of the block, its frontage, and then even urban type. And again, the last Toronto example and the Chinese example, both of those, I would argue, I think it's fair to say, on the one hand, the design teams claim that the block structure and typology come from a study of ecology a priori. And in my reading, I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, one of the easiest ways to make that case is by just talking about the kind of shape of the block. If you look at this, right? I don't know how well that's showing up, but basically, if you look at the shape of the block, there's a kind of tendency on the one hand for block structure to be regularized, block dimension to be regularized, and in particular to be regularized in a kind of gridiron fashion. This is coming both from infrastructure efficiency, but also coming from real estate development, right? The kind of depth of block that one needs. You can also see an historical trend where the depth of block is getting larger and larger, right? So block sizes are growing historically. What I see in both of these projects is basically deferring questions of block structure, block size, and depth later in the design process, so that ultimately, infrastructure questions emerge and help frame block sizes. And in this case, with this idea about the parametric model, the geometry of the block structure changes block by block, and therefore the typicality of it changes. Equally in this, and also in the Toronto example, there's a very aggressive idea about linking parametrics and modeling to sun angles, solar response, and wind. And those kinds of things have been available, right? But I've seen very few examples of urban communities, new portions of city, that have been driven by them as a kind of third-order effect. So on that basis as well, another thing we could talk about is density. If you look at the ground plane of either of these projects, they essentially are less dense at the ground plane than normative development would suggest that they should be, right? So if you look in this image here, for example, I mean, one of the arguments is that the parametric model itself will allow for a kind of responsiveness to various ecological knowledges or literacies. Another of the arguments here is that in response to various other forms of knowledge, whether they be historic preservation ideas or the existing pudong, or ideas about height or density which come from other cultural or architectural assumptions, that these things might be responsive. So certainly with respect to block size and block orientation, I see a responsiveness to environmental factors in these two projects, and clearly there are other examples of urbanism available. But if you look at the question of density, these projects have both reduced the density of their urban realm to accommodate more ecological function. The Chris Reed scheme in Toronto does maybe more so than the Shenzhen competition entry. And as a result is kind of, I think, an example. But you can see here that this is the kind of territory that traditional urbanism just wouldn't have conceived of, right? I mean, it's the kind of environment that was critiqued as really a part of the so-called failures of modernism. Now, there are questions, social questions, and a whole range of other issues to do with living on a wetland, right? It used to be a pejorative, right? Living on a swamp was a condition to be avoided for a whole host of reasons. But the idea that a wetland could both provide ecological health, but also produce a new kind of block structure in relationship to the build-out of new residential blocks, I think, and I'm happy to be, dissuaded of this, I think that these two examples are actually quite progressive with respect to using environmental and ecological factors to shape the urban form. Now, with respect to architectural invention, they're both kind of frisky and progressive with respect to the buildings basically pushing back against the block structure. I didn't show much of the Shenzhen project, but there's a whole piece of it which deals with building type and allowing a kind of architectural autonomy from the block structure in which the ground plane goes up and moves around a bit. I found that slightly more provocative than need be for my argument, so I didn't include it. But certainly here in the case of the Chris Reed scheme in Toronto, what you see is you see each individual building has a different kind of typological relationship to a kind of water. And if you had heard more from the authors themselves, they would have told you that each of these towers is basically developed as a kind of identity relative to certain kinds of lifestyle. So you can decide to be a kind of a fish person that eats fish or a fish person that watches fish. And you can watch birds on one end of the complex, or you can actually have a boat parked in your marina. And there's this kind of relationship between lifestyle, building type, and access to different kinds of water affordance, right? So on each of those measures, I guess I could mount an argument that these things are unique typologically. This begs the next question of, well, what about the building material performance and system performance? Right? Well, nicely played. First of all, with respect to the Darwinian reference, it's the 200th anniversary or something. I mean, Darwin is in the air, so let's just go there directly. I think initially one could see a kind of easy kind of elision, like, oh, you're using terms to refer to natural ecology and just sliding onto human populations. Careful. First of all, if you back up a step, it was in fact the old left that did this first. Okay. Second of all, in landscape urbanist discourse, one of the things you see quite clearly is with the adoption of this kind of neoliberal economic condition, a kind of careful treading. I mean, you don't see Corner or Hus getting sideways on questions of gender or identity politics. You don't see them getting sideways on questions of gentrification. I appreciate that we're all concerned, many of us are concerned with questions of class as they relate to questions of race and access to housing. We live in cities that have increasing land values until 2 months ago, and we live in cities that have a great demand for the kind of quality of life. And there are communities which are vulnerable to these forces. My point tonight is not to dismiss any of that, but simply to say the historical mechanisms that we've built, especially the planning mechanisms that we've built in Toronto especially, that I know quite well, are actually built to protect those communities, and they do an extraordinary job of doing so. Are there challenges? Of course there are. Having said that, the Hilbersheimer position, which is socially progressive, mixed race, mixed class, but at the same moment understands that the economic paradigm is not something that the architecture can overturn, gives us a kind of choice. We have a choice between, on the one hand, basically finding tools, as Hilbersheimer and others have, which are appropriate to the economic order of the day, or simply trying to use other means to resist that economic order. And I appreciate the struggle and respect those that try to resist those forces. But to use architecture urbanism as a mechanism to overturn those forces seems like the least conceivable practical approach. On the one hand, you know, as I said already, I'm a reader of David Harvey, and I respect enormously Noam Chomsky. But having said that, to use architecture as the mechanism through which to resist those forces strikes me as somehow naive. Now, to the next part of what you're saying, the question of what kind of future community will we have is an open question. And I think it's fair to say that the landscape urbanists are responding to conditions as found, which are dominated by neoliberal economic models. They also are responding to places in which immigration tend to be the prime movers. Cities that are shrinking are doing so because their organic birth rate is not nearly keeping up with death. And at the same moment, those that are growing, like Toronto and others, are doing so by international immigration. So what it does is it folds back on political questions, questions of, are we going to protect communities from gentrification? In this particular project, I can tell you, this land is empty for the sake of its industrial use. It's converting industrial land into residential land. And on that score, I think I've got a pretty firm argument here. I mean, nobody's being displaced from their home. In fact, the trade-off is, do you want additional industrial functioning here or not when the industrial jobs have left anyway? Ironically, in my reading of the kind of paradigm of modernist welfare state planning, it's in that literature that you find this elision from Darwinism on the ecological side to Darwinism on the social side. If you want to find social Darwinism, I don't think you're going to find it in the landscape urbanist practice. You're going to find it in 20th century discourse, which is actually a part of the kind of mantra of the old left. Just one example to kind of bring that home. If you have a conversation about species in relationship to their habitat, the entire discourse in North America is largely driven around ideas about nativity and regional specificity. The entire McCarthyan project, I could argue, is built upon the idea of the appropriate response of the species to the environment, defined regionally. If we go from McCarg, back through Mackay, back through Geddes, the entire literature of regional planning is informed by an essentially racist discourse. In architecture, we've already unpacked that. We know that the Chicago School ideas about regionalism come directly from ideas about race as they relate to place. Whereas in discussions of landscape and plant material, we haven't yet undone that. So I think it's actually quite the reverse, that it's the kind of regionalist idea of the valley section in which we all inhabit a portion of the section appropriate to our race or ethnicity that really sends a kind of shiver up my spine. Great. Thanks.